Picture this. You just bought your first camera. Now you don't know what the hell to do. You watched a couple YouTube tutorials. Now you grabbed a couple buddies and you're like, you know what? Let's go take some pics. So you got some friends, you go into a park, you start taking some pictures. Now, your camera is on auto, but you watch your YouTube videos, you watch your tutorials, and everybody's been telling you, shoot on manual. So you decide to flick that thing to manual, take a picture, and it's completely dark. What the hell do you do? What's going on, everybody? My name is Mahidi Hassan, and today we're going to be talking about exposure theory. So when you're shooting manual photography, there are three things that you absolutely need to know, alright? These are considered the fundamentals of photography. A lot of people refer to them as the exposure triangle. What you need to know about exposure theory and exposure triangle in general is these three settings are essentially affecting and controlling the way light interacts with your camera. That's the big thing at the end of the day. They have different effects, but at the end of the day, you're just controlling the amount of light that is being taken in by your camera. So these three settings, what are they? It's going to be shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So shutter speed is essentially how quickly or slowly your camera actually moves and to take that picture. So if you have a fast shutter speed, your camera is going to take a picture, boom, real quick. But if you have a slow shutter speed, it's really going to take its time to take that photo. Now you must be wondering how this impacts your actual image. So if you have a fast shutter speed, alright, it's going to allow less light into your camera. But if you have a slower shutter speed, that gives it more time to allow more light into your camera. So if you have a fast shutter speed, that allows you to capture things that are in motion. So if somebody is running really fast, or if you're taking pictures of a car that's zooming down the road and you want to get a nice crisp image of that subject, you use a fast shutter speed. On the opposite side of things, you can use a slow shutter speed to really capture things that are in motion, but with a nice blurry effect. So these are typically called long exposures. So a lot of times, and something very popular people do, is they do long exposures of, say, a waterfall. So you have the water falling and you do your long exposure for maybe 1 second, 2 seconds, sometimes even 30 seconds. And this actually creates a cool effect where the water looks smoothed over. So that's how you achieve that effect with shutter speed. Now your shutter speed on your camera, regardless of what kind of a camera that you have, alright, is going to show up in terms of seconds. So you might see the numbers 1 over 100, 1 over 500. What does that mean? So that's essentially the fraction of a second. It's essentially a fraction of a second. That's how quickly your camera is taking that photo. So if your shutter speed is set to 1 over 100, it's going to take that picture at 1/100th of a second. Similarly, if it's over 1 over 2000, it's taking that picture a lot faster. It's doing it in 1/2000th of a second. Now on the other side, like I mentioned, you can have your shutter speed range all the way from really, really fast, say 1 over 5000, to really, really slow, to say even 1 second, 2 seconds, even 30 seconds, depending on the type of camera that you have. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is aperture. So aperture is pretty much how wide or narrow your camera lens is when you're shooting. So the wider your aperture is, the more light that your camera body is going to be able to get, and the more light that's going to get to the sensor. And the more narrow it is, the less amount of light that it's going to let into the camera. So with aperture, what you can do is achieve this effect called a shallow depth of field. So you see this a lot when people are taking portrait photos. The subject, the person's face, is very, very sharp and in focus, and everything else that's behind them is blurred out. So this creates a very nice effect where it's isolating the subject, and it really forces you to pay attention to what the photographer or the person wants you to really pay attention to. Now this is achieved with changing the aperture setting on your camera. So aperture is a little confusing in the way that it's actually described and the way it's actually on your camera. So aperture is measured in f-stops. So it can go anywhere, say from an f1.8 all the way up to an f22. And it's a little counterintuitive in the way it's actually explained. So an f1.8 is a relatively wide aperture. That means your opening of your camera is very, very wide. But if you have an say 22, it's a very, very small opening, and it's very, very narrow. So it's really counterintuitive in the sense that the higher the number value, the more narrow your camera lens is and the less amount of light that's going to let in. So like I mentioned before, you are using these settings to control the amount of light that's coming in. But at the same time, as you're controlling the light, these functions also have different side effects, like I mentioned. So the shutter speed, it allows you to, really snap a quick photo of something. Aperture really changes the focus of what you're shooting. The last setting that we're going to talk about is ISO. So your ISO is your camera's sensitivity to the amount of light that's coming in. So different cameras have different types and different size sensors. Some cameras have full frame sensors and other cameras will have crop sensors. So depending on the size of your sensor, your ISO is going to affect your picture differently. So essentially what this setting does is it brightens or darkens your image. So if you have a lower ISO, your picture is going to be darker. And if you increase the ISO, your picture is going to be brighter. One other effect that you can achieve with a high ISO is actually adding grain to your photo. So that's one of the drawbacks as well, depending on how you look at it. If you bump your ISO up way too high, your picture becomes noisy or grain is introduced to it and you don't get that nice, sharp, clean image. So your ISO value can range anywhere from 100 all the way up to 64,000. So it really depends on what type of camera you have. But like I said, always keep in mind, ISO is the last setting that you should really adjust. By default, I like to keep my ISO low. I like to keep it at around 100 or 200. Only if my other settings are fixed and I need to, get more light in, I bump up the ISO. Alright, so let's run through a couple scenarios so we can see how these three things really work together. So say scenario 1. You're outside and you're taking headshots of your friend. It's a bright, bright sunny day. So when you're taking portrait shots or headshots, you typically want, like I mentioned, that shallow depth of field where you want their face to be in focus and you want the background to be really blurred out. To achieve that look, you want your aperture to be as wide as possible, depending on what type of lens you have. Some kit lenses, it only goes down to about an f4.0, if you're lucky an f3.5. But if you do buy say a prime lens, which has a fixed focal length, you can achieve wider apertures at about say 1.8 or even 1.4, depending on what kind of lens you have. So you set your aperture really wide, 1.8. Snap your photo and your photo is absolutely blown out. It's completely white, you can't even see the subject. So what do? So typically when you're taking portraits, your subject is not moving. So in this case, you can afford to crank that shutter speed really high. So you're going to take it say from 1/100, which you may be shooting at, to, depending on how bright it is, all the way up to 1/800, maybe even 1/1000 just to be safe, depending on how your photo is exposed. So hopefully this will allow you to get a very nice, non-blown out photo. You're gonna bring that exposure right in the middle and it's gonna be nice and sweet. All right, scenario 2. You were tasked with shooting a soccer match. Your objective is to shoot the players and get some action shots of them kicking the soccer ball. All right, so in this case, let's analyze. You're gonna need a fast shutter speed because you really wanna get a quick snapshot of what's going on. You wanna get their foot just kicking that soccer ball. You don't want it to be blurry as they're kicking that ball. You want it to be nice and crisp. So to do that, you need a very fast shutter speed, probably something about 1/1000, maybe 1/2000, depending on the other conditions. So like we mentioned, the higher your shutter speed and the faster your shutter speed, the less amount of light that's going to be let in. So depending on how fast of a shutter you're shooting, that could really darken your image. So to compensate, what do? We open up that aperture. Like I said before, you can take this to about maybe 1.8, 1.4, depending on what type of lens you're using. And this is going to allow, and it's going to counterbalance that really fast shutter speed and allow a lot more light in. Now, like I mentioned, you can't forget about the side effects that you get with these features. With that wide aperture, you're also going to get a shallower depth of field. So now this can work in your favor or it might not, depending on what you're trying to do, but this will allow you to, again, isolate your subject, say, as they're kicking that ball, which might be a good look. All right, scenario 3. This time, you were tasked with shooting an indoor basketball game. So again, this is a fast action sport similar to the soccer scenario, so you're going to need a fast shutter speed. But unlike the other situation here, this is indoors, so the amount of light that you have to work with is a lot less. You don't have, the sun providing all that sun and light for you, which would make things so much easier. So in this situation, you have that fast shutter speed, so to compensate, like before, what are we going to do? Open up that aperture, baby. It's going to allow you to get a lot more light in there, and like I mentioned before, that shallow depth of field, your photos are going to look sweet, right? Boom, so you snap away, and your picture is still dark. What the hell do you do now? So this is when you mess with the ISO. Remember, I told you guys, make sure you mess with all the other settings first before you come to ISO. Only when, say, your shutter speed and your aperture are fixed and adjusted to the max that you can really change, depending on what you're trying to achieve, only then should you touch your ISO. So here, go ahead, crank your ISO up from a default of maybe 100 to even 400, 800, depending on the type of camera you have. You can probably go a little bit higher, and this should brighten up your image a lot more. And I'll mention one more time, be very careful. You will get grain if you go way too high. This is one of the things that I was not careful of when I was first shooting. I remember I went to Iceland, took a bunch of bomb photos, but I didn't realize my ISO was set on auto, and it was shooting at like ISO like 1200, 3600 by default when I was outside with the bright sun, and all my photos turned out grainy, and I was like super confused and I had no idea what to do. It was terrible. But you know what? It was a learning opportunity. That's gonna be it for this video, guys. I hope you guys learned a thing or two. If you're just starting out with photography, this is the first thing that you really need to learn, and you really need to practice. You can watch all the YouTube videos that you want. That's what I did for hours when I was first starting. The first time I went out there after watching hours and hours of YouTube videos, I still had no idea what to do because I was confused. I was like, what the hell do I do? My photo's all dark. What do I adjust? But you know what? Best way to learn, practice. Cool. Yeah.
Practice doesn't make it perfect. Perfect practice makes it perfect.
Perfect practice makes perfect. So I'm told by my sister.
So you know.
Don't just practice, alright? Make sure you perfect practice. Hit that like button, subscribe to my channel if you want to learn more about photography, and just follow along. Daily lifestyle, we got vlogs coming. Hopefully, like I said, once we can start traveling again, we're going to get that vlog series going one more time. It's going to be awesome.
Show them where the button is.
The subscribe button is down there, so my sister says. So hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. And you know what? I'd really appreciate it if you could share this video. Send it to one other person if you found this helpful, if you found it entertaining, or if you learned a thing or two. Until next time, stay safe, stay swag.
That wasn't mine.
It takes a little bit to kind of get into the zone. All right, so let's do it. What's going on, everybody? Hope you guys are doing good. Stop laughing. What's going on, everybody? Hope you guys are doing well today. What am I saying?
Look at her swim.
This is the intro, right?
I like that leg situation.
Yeah, no, but you can't see it. So. All right, quiet on set.